the Medici.
Cosimo I.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Cosimo I. Born 1519. Reigned 1537 to 1574. Created Grand Duke of Tuscany 1569. Died 1574. When, on the 5th of January 1587, Alessandro's sudden death took place, all was for some days in great confusion. Since the Signora having been abolished, Florence was left by the Duke's death without any government. Moreover, there were none left on whom it devolved to form one. Pope Clement VII, Ippolito, and now Alessandro were all dead. No male descendant of the eldest branch of the Medici family remained. Neither the Strozzi, Guicciardini, Ridolfi, nor any other family in Florence felt themselves capable of assuming the place which had been taken by the Medici. While the reigning Pope, Paul III, had no particular interest in Florentine affairs, so that there seemed no reason why Florence should not reinstate her republic, and as those in charge of the fortresses were ready to agree to it, everything appeared to point to this course. It was, however, not adopted. The council called the 48 still nominally existed, though under Alessandro it had no power. And whilst its leading members were discussing the situation, and before anything definite had been decided upon, there appeared in Florence from the district of Mugello an almost unknown youth of 17, Cosimo, son of Giovanni della Bandinere, accompanied by one or two attendants. Failing Lorenzino himself, who had fled and made no claim to the rule, this youth was, supposing a republic was not going to be set up, rightfully heir to the succession, while from one point of view his claim might be considered superior to any which could be put forward on behalf of Lorenzino, in that his mother being a granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, both branches of the Medici united in him. This youth, by his artful assumption of a humble demeanour, by the little that was known of him, seemed to indicate that he was not likely to take a prominent part in affairs of state, and by his promises that if he were appointed to the rule all power should remain in the hands of the council, induced the chief senators to accept him as his head of state. We are told that he concealed his ambition under so humble and submissive demeanour as to provoke the contempt of his friends. The four principal senators, Guicciardini, Strozzi, Valori, and Acciajuoli, were completely taken in, and chose him with the idea that he was a youth of little character, whose interests chiefly centred in shooting and field sports, and that he would be a nonentity, and would leave them to rule the country. Accordingly, he was elected as chief of state, it being definitely laid down that all power was to rest with the council. A bas relief showing this episode is to be seen on the pedestal of the equestrian statue of Cosimo I in the Piazza della Signoria, and very faithfully reproduces an unassuming attitude, which was adopted by Cosimo. Thus did Francesco Guicciardini, Filippo Strozzi, Baccio Valori, and Niccolò Acciajuoli, in order to obtain their own personal ends, deliver over their country to an iron-handed tyrant. Guicciardini, the chief of them, mainly so acting because he had hoped that Cosimo would marry his daughter Elisabetta, and that he, Guicciardini, would rule Florence while the young head of the state amused himself. They all had a bitter cause, in a very short time, to repent their action. Simultaneously with this election, a decree was, at Cosimo's request, passed by the council, putting the whole of Lorenzino's branch out of the succession in consequence of his murder of Alessandro, Cosimo pointing out that this was advisable in order to make his position unimpeachable. No sooner, however, was Cosimo installed as chief of the state than he threw off the mask which he had worn. He cast all these councillors aside, assumed absolute authority, and showed himself in his true colours as an arbitrary tyrant who intended to rule by fear. He soon became the most dreaded man in Florence. Of course, such an entire reversal of all that had been contemplated was bound to issue in a struggle. Before many months were over, Cosimo's tyrannical actions had driven a large number of citizens into voluntary exile, including Filippo Strozzi and Baccio Valori, and by the end of the summer of 1537 these fuoriusciti had assembled an army to dethrone him, for which purpose they had also gained the help of a considerable body of French troops. The main portion of these forces consisted of 4,000 infantry and 300 cavalry, commanded by Filippo Strozzi's eldest son, Piero Strozzi, already a distinguished soldier. Meanwhile Cosimo had also got together a force, and by representing himself as the successor of the Emperor's vassal Alessandro, had obtained the assistance of the imperial troops in Tuscany. His whole force was under the command of Alessandro Vitelli. The battle to decide the fate of Tuscany was fought at Monte Murillo, which is a now overly forgotten place, near Prato, on the 1st August 1537. It resulted in Vitelli's gaining a victory, which saved Cosimo and delivered all his opponents into his hands. Vitelli's success was chiefly due to a fortunate accident. The body of troops attacked by him were, in reality, only the advanced guard of the enemy's force, their main body under Piero Strozzi being away at a distance in the mountains. But with the body defeated by Vitelli were Filippo Strozzi, Baccio Valori, and all the principal men of the party opposed to Cosimo, all of whom were captured. The main body of Piero Strozzi only heard of the defeat of the troops at Monte Muello, with the capture of all the leaders, when the battle was over, and was too late to do anything. And Piero Strozzi had no course but to retire. The column which stands in the Piazza Santa Trinita, surrounded by a fine figure of Justice, was erected by Cosimo to commemorate the victory of Monte Muello, which gave him his throne. Of all the buildings in Florence, one possesses a more solemn interest than any of them. Interest of the same kind as attaches to the Tower of London, namely the gloomy citadel of the Bargello. Terrible have been the scenes which its courtyard, the place of execution, and surrounding cells have witnessed. Piteous the cries with which its torture chamber, now the armory, which is the only oubliette in Florence, has resounded. Heartbreaking the grief endured in the open loggia overlooking the courtyard, where so many bitter wrongs have had their cruel ending. None can climb its picturesque staircase, or traverse its halls, insensible to the tragic memories which cling round this ancient fortress of Podesta of Florence, where so many who were notable have taken their last look on life. And the victories of Montemuelo added many sad memories which attached to the Bargello. For Cosimo, who had set up a despotism no less severe than that of the kings of England and France of that time, to be consigned to the Bargello was apt to be fatal to the person concerned as to be committed to the Tower or to the Bastille. The prisoners taken at Montemuelo were very numerous and of high rank, for there was scarcely one of the leading families of Florence which had not some member among them, or a Florentine student at Bologna or Padua who had not joined Filippo Strozzi and Baccio Valori in this attempt. Many of them were quite young, and not a few were Cosimo's personal friends, but they received no mercy, for in Cosimo that quality was non-existent. The cells of the Bargello were crowded with prisoners of distinction, and when the Bargello could hold no more, the remainder were sent to the Fortezza. The prisoners were executed in batches day after day, while the halls rang the cries of the tortured. Not one was pardoned. All were in turn first tortured, then executed. Baccio Valori and his son, the young Albizzi, were among those put to death at the Borgello. Filippo Strozzi, confined in irony in the Fortezza, to build which he had provided the funds, was either put to death here, or committed suicide to escape further torture, his body being found in his cell, transfixed with the sword. Thus ended the rich, handsome, and accomplished courtier and banker Filippo Strozzi, the husband of Clarice de Medici, and friend of popes and kings, to whom only 7 years before Cosimo's mother had written that humble petition on behalf of Cosimo and herself for time in which to pay debt. Cosimo confiscated the Strozzi Palace in the Via Tornabuoni and the whole of Filippo Strozzi's possessions. Pietro il Gottoso, 70 years before, had contrived to put down an armed rebellion against himself without the sacrifice of a single life. Cosimo I seemed anxious to create the greatest contrast possible, for of all the enemies who fell into his hands, he did not spare a single life. No wonder that Maria Salviati, looking with horror on these proceedings of her son, which she was powerless to prevent, shut herself in deepest seclusion at the villa of Castello. Cosimo was, in fact, a most unusual character. Neither his mother nor any of those around him, to the age of 17, were in the least prepared for the action which he then suddenly took. The bold stroke which he seized upon the rule of Florence astounded Maria Salviati, and was as great a revelation of character to her as to everyone else. How completely he had contrived to hide his real nature from all those who knew him as a boy, is shown by the case of Filippo Strozzi, who, though he had been on intimate terms with him and his mother while they resided at Trebbia, was none the less as much taken in as other senators. Cosimo is perhaps the only instance of record of a boy hitherto occupying an obscure position, giving up to sport and a country life, and thought to have little capacity, and suddenly casting aside every boyish taste, undertaking the arduous labors of government, seizing the rule of his country from her wisest and ablest men, and slaughtering wholesale her leading citizens. But although Cosimo thus showed himself a cruel and merciless tyrant, in his subsequent history he manifested extraordinary abilities, which results for which his country had every reason to be grateful. It is indeed little short of marvelous how one who, silent and taciturn by nature, had in his youth been considered dull, timid, and wanting in character, yet developed the capacity to raise Tuscany to the highest pitch of political importance and general well-being which she ever reached. Tuscany, which ever since the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent, under the successive maladministration of Sederini, Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, Passerini, the Republican government of 1527 to 1530, and Alessandro, had over 40 years possessed little or no political importance in Italy, was by Cosimo I raised to a higher position in this respect among the states of Italy than she had occupied even in the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent. The glory of the leadership in art and learning was no longer hers. The joy and brightness of the Renaissance were forever passed away, overwhelmed in the wars which for more than a generation had raged over Italy. But in so far as the remaining factors of political influence, military strength, and commercial progress were concerned, Cosimo I raised Tuscany, not merely to her former level, but beyond it, so much so that she became under him the only state of first-class importance in Italy. Cosimo Pater Patriae and Lorenzo the Significant had gloried in advancing the boundaries of the state, but under Cosimo I, Tuscany was almost doubled in size, while at the same time the conditions in regard to the administration of justice and the general advancement of the country were changed from these customary in the Middle Ages to those thought necessary in modern times. And Cosimo did all this by himself, for his principle was to avoid taking any counsellors, and throughout his life those whom he employed to assist him were nothing more than secretaries. None were given a sufficient power of initiative for the names to have obtained any record in history. They were invariably men of a humble station in life, and always chosen from other parts of the country than Florence. As soon as Cosimo had, by the victory of Montemurlo and the execution of all who had opposed him, firmly secured his power, he set about arrangements for that gradual advancement of his position, which he had set before him. As yet he had merely been elected by the Florentines as head of their state, so that his first step was to obtain formal recognition of his position by the emperor, representing himself as willing to be the emperor's vassal, and ready to promote his cause. In every way against the French interests in Italy, he obtained what he sought, the emperor issuing a diploma which conferred on Cosimo all the authority formerly borne and exercised by Duke Alessandro. And though the diploma did not categorically confer on Cosimo the title of Duke, the latter from this time forth always signed himself Duca di Fiorenza, to which no exception was taken by the emperor. In this connection it is interesting to notice that in the rooms lately reopened on the upper floor of the Palazzo Vecchio, over the 16th century fireplace, in Cosimo's room, his title is seen to be inscribed as Cosimo's Floria Dux II, showing that at this time in his life, previous to his obtaining the status of Grand Duke, making him Cosimo I, he called himself Dux II, the second Duke of Florence, the first being Alessandro. Cosimo's next step was to set about arrangements for marriage, such as would contribute to the strength of his position. He first endeavored strenuously to get the emperor to give him his daughter Margaret, Alessandro's young widow. But this Charles I absolutely refused to do, while at the same time insisting on Cosimo's making over to Margaret a very large portion of the Medici property, much to Cosimo's indignation. This first matrimonial project having failed, the latter turned elsewhere, and in 1539 succeeded in arranging a marriage for himself with Eleanor, the only child of Don Pedro di Toledo, Marquis of Villafranca and Viceroy of Naples, the most capable and trusted of all the emperor's lieutenants, who ruled the kingdom of Naples from 1532 to his death in 1553. Eleanor de Toledo was escorted to Florence by Don Pedro himself, and they were met by Cosimo at the villa of Poggio Acciano, 15 miles from Florence. The Viceroy of Naples and his suite were lodged during the stay in Florence in the monastery of St. Maria Novella, and after many festivities, Cosimo and Eleonora were married with much ceremony in the church of San Lorenzo, he being then 20 and she 17. Eleonora was very rich, and her wealth, together with the political influence which Cosimo gained by becoming the son-in-law of the Viceroy of Naples, made a considerable difference in his position. The portrait of Eleonora by Bronzino on the wall of one of the rooms in the Palazzo Vecchio shows her as she was at about the age of 20, 2 or 3 years later after her marriage. She has a fine, broad forehead and a pleasing face. Up to this time, Cosimo had lived in the Medici Palace in Via Larga, and it was there that he brought home his bride. But shortly after making this marriage, Cosimo removed into the Palazzo Vecchio, having the rooms on the second floor, which had been those always occupied by Gonfalonieri, handsomely decorated for Eleonora's reception. He had several reasons for this change of residence, but his principal one was that the Medici Palace was not a defensible castle, and possessed no accommodation for the bodyguard of troops necessary to protect his person, while his occupation at the Palazzo Vecchio, which for a century had been associated in the minds of Florentines with the governing body, not only gave him a more secure abode, but also emphasized the fact that he alone now wielded the power of the state. Other rulers around him, such as the Astet Fela and Gonzaga Atamantua, each occupied their castello in the center of their capital city, and no other residence was in fact suitable for a despotic ruler such as Cosimo desired all men to recognize that he intended to be. Immediately at the door of the palace, and passed daily by him, stood Donatello's statue of Judith laying Holofernes, with the inscription which the citizens had placed on it, as a warning to all who might attempt to tyrannize over Florence. And this Cosimo suffered to remain as it was, in grim irony at the wide contrast between the sentiment expressed by the inscription and the rule which he had established. His bodyguard of Swiss lancers he placed, during the hours that they were on duty, in Orcagna's loggia, which thus acquired the name, by which it has always since been known, of the Loggia dell'Anzi. The Palazzo Vecchio was a somewhat restricted and gloomy abode for Eleonora, but Cosimo had other plans for the future, and intended arranging for himself and Eleonora a much larger and grander residence, later on, when he should feel sufficiently firmly established. Meanwhile, by incorporating the buildings on the eastern side, including the residences of the Esecutore di Giustizia and the Capitano dei Fanti. He considerably enlarged the Palazzo Vecchio, and he and Eleonora lived there for 10 years, 6 of their 8 children being born there. But until he had an army of his own, independent alike of any troops lent him by the emperor and of Florentines levies, Cosimo could not feel secure. Added to which he had views on the future of extending the boundaries of Tuscany when opportunity should offer, and for this powerful army would be necessary. He therefore gradually raised a force of Swiss, German, and Italian troops, the latter recruited from other parts of Italy than Tuscany, and soon had a small but strong army, which he steadily increased in numbers. In order to strengthen his hold on Florence, he also much enlarged the fortezza and augmented the number of troops quartered there. By the above means, Cosimo, by the time he was 21, had firmly established himself as a despotic ruler of Tuscany. Bronzino's portrait of him in the Pitti Gallery, one of the best portraits the Bronzini had ever executed, painted, Vasari tells us, when Cosimo was 40, accords closely with the description of his appearance given by contemporary writers. These state that his face gave no indication of the great abilities which he possessed, and he had a dark and impenetrable disposition, with a fierce power and relentless anger, all the more terrible because it burnt under the surface. For the first 10 years of his reign, Cosimo was chiefly occupied in strengthening his position as Duke of Florence. The three main factors in European politics were, as before, Francis I, Charles V, and the Pope, Paul III. During the years 1536 and 1537, the latter had continued to labor earnestly to bring about the peace between the two antagonists, but for some time without avail. At length, in June 1538, he got both Charles and Francis to come to Nice, although they would not meet, and the Pope had to conduct negotiations by personally visiting them alternately. So that much credit is due to him for the success he eventually achieved in getting them to agree to a truce which caused a cessation of the conflict for 4 years. At the end of that time, however, they were again at war, and Cosimo had to choose his side, abandoning the traditional Florentine policy of alliance with France. Cosimo, throughout his reign, threw himself heart and soul on the side of the emperor, opposing the operations of the French in Italy on all occasions. At the same time, beginning as the emperor's vassal, he gradually purchased his independence. When the war between Francis and Charles was resumed in 1542, and 5 separate French armies invaded Charles's territories, the emperor, to raise troops to meet this attack, borrowed money largely from Cosimo, who in return obtained the withdrawal of the imperial garrisons from Florence and Pisa. The same process was repeated on several subsequent occasions, Cosimo taking a step further in the same direction every time that the emperor was in need of funds until he attained entire independence. Nevertheless, after he had done so, he still continued the same policy of always siding with the emperor and against the French, so that he came eventually to be Charles V's mainstay in Italy. While the accessions of territory, which from time to time the emperor had helped him to acquire, by increasing Cosimo's power, also Charles's feeling of security was increased as regards to Italy. In 1544, peace was made for a time between Francis and Charles at Crepy. And in December 1545, the Council of the Church, which had been talked of for so many years, at last assembled in Trent. It, however, failed to possess the character which had been intended. For instead of the two parties in the dispute being present, only one of them was represented at it. Neither the Church of England nor the Protestant party in Germany and France sending any representatives to it, so that it became merely a council of the Roman Church, and as such lost all interest for Europe as a whole. In 1546, the Strozzi brothers, who had never ceased to make vengeance against Cosimo for their father's death, made an attack on him, with the assistance of Francesco Bonamacchi from Lucca, but the attempt failed. In 1547, the long triangular duel, which had lasted for over a quarter of a century, came to an end by the death in the early part of that year of two of the antagonists, Henry VIII and Francis I. Just when Francis was preparing a fresh attack upon Charles, this removal of his two rivals materially increased Charles V's power, as all states in Italy soon felt, and in particular the Pope. The attempt of the latter to introduce the Inquisition, which had been established in Rome in 1542, into Naples, was defeated, Charles refusing to allow it. The Pope was also endeavoring to get the Council of Trent removed to some city in Italy, and intriguing for this purpose with the French against Charles. But in this, as in all his undertakings, he found a strong opponent in Cosimo, whose state of Tuscany was rapidly becoming the strongest in Italy. At this time we find Cosimo tendering remarkable advice to Charles V, urging him in a letter of the 6th February 1547 to use his power for a complete reform of the Church through the Council, tasking away the tyranny of the priests, reducing the power of the Pope to its proper spiritual limits, restoring the pure faith of Christ without the abuses that had grown up around it. Whilst all those in Italy who were in opposition to the emperor looked natural to the pope for assistance in the young Duke Cosimo, says Ranke, and Paul III found the very man best fitted to oppose him. And Cosimo himself, in a letter about this time, says, "The Pope, who has succeeded in so many undertakings, has now no wish more earnest than doing something in Florence as well. He would fain estrange the state from the emperor, but this hope he shall carry with him to his grave." In this year 1547, Cosimo managed to remove from his path a danger which had from the first threatened him. The degree which he had obtained at the time of his election, putting Lorenzino's branch of the family out of the succession, still left him open, with a feeling of insecurity, as it was always open to his enemies to get up an agitation to dethrone him, on the ground that Lorenzino was the lawful head of the family, and the rightful ruler of Florence. Lorenzino's death was therefore much to be desired, and Cosimo had long tried to achieve it, but without success. Lorenzino, after many wanderings in France, Turkey, and other countries, had eventually settled with his mother, Maria Soderini, at Venice, where he lived in constant fear of his life, knowing that Cosimo was employing the most skilled assassins to dog his steps. Knowing the dangers which were around him in the narrow little streets, he seldom trusted himself anywhere outside his house except in a gondola. At length, one night in 1547, he was caught unawares in a narrow street by two hired assassins employed by Cosimo, and murdered. The account of how they killed him was related by themselves, and may be read in full detail in various recordings of the time. Cosimo's plea for this act was that he was only carrying out a just execution of Lorenzino for the murder of Alessandro. Throughout his life he had adopted the same attitude on this subject. The view that Lorenzino's act was inspired by a desire to liberate his country by creating sympathy with Lorenzino militated seriously against Cosimo's usurpation of the rule of Florence, while it might inspire others to similar actions against himself, and as it was in order to excite a feeling against Lorenzino, and to extinguish, if possible, the above view of his act, though no other reason for the deed could ever be produced, that Cosimo, on coming to power, had the house broken down, and that he and his successors, the Grand Dukes, endeavored in all ways to keep as much odium as possible on Lorenzino's name, with the result that Lorenzino had been handed down to us, not as he was looked upon by his contemporaries, viz. As the Florentine Brutus, but as one whom every abusive epithet may freely be cast. In 1548, Cosimo succeeded in performing an important service for Charles V. The Republic of Siena had revolted from the latter, driven out his representative and the Spanish garrison, and placed themselves under the protection of the Pope. Cosimo offered to mediate between the two parties, and which was accepted immediately, and he was so successful that he was able to pacify the Sienese and arrange an agreement that Siena's ancient form of government should be respected by the emperor, while a representative of the latter with Spanish garrison should be admitted. Both France and the Pope were now preparing to attack the Emperor, and he was strengthening himself in every way in Italy for the conflict. As one measure to that, and the harbour of Portoferraggio and the adjacent district in the island of Elba was given to Cosimo, and he in a short time made Portoferraggio the strongest naval station in the Mediterranean. He was also allowed to occupy Piombino for a time to assist him in defending his own coastline near Pisa, and gained various accessions of territory along the coast. In 1549 Pope Paul III died, and since his successor, Julius III, adopted a more amicable policy towards the emperor, this tended to create peace in Italy. In 10 years from the time of his marriage, Cosimo had so firmly established his rule that he felt able to occupy a different kind of residence from the Palazzo Vecchio. Well, this change was the more desirable, since he and Eleonora had now 7 children, the eldest of them being 9 years old. Accordingly, early in 1550, Cosimo, imitating the ancestor after whom he had been named, set about building a new palace for the family, that which is now the royal palace in Florence, and which, though known to us as the Pitti Palace, was entirely built by the Medici, and was their home during 200 years. To carry out this purpose, Cosimo bought, with Eleonora's money, this estate covering the northwestern slope of the Boboli Hill, on the southern side of the Arno, together with, at the foot of the hill, the portion of the palace which had begun, more than 80 years before, by Luca Pitti, but which the family never had the money to finish. This, when Cosimo bought it, consisted only of a small centre portion of the present building, embraced by the 3 centre arches of the ground floor, and the 7 windows above them. It was only completed up to the top of the first floor, and was still unroofed, leaving more than half the building, even as it existed in Cosimo I's reign, to be completed. Except this small nucleus, the hall of the palace, as we see it, was built by the Medici. Cosimo, assisted by his able architect Amadnati, completed the centre portion up to the roof, but without extending it laterally, which alone suffices to show that the present central court did not exist even in his time. The estate and the unfinished building upon it were sold to Cosimo by Buonaccorso Pitti for 9,000 gold to Florence. It is generally stated that the Pitti Palace is built on the design which it had, 100 years before, been drawn up by Brunelleschi for Luca Pitti. But this, while of course totally incorrect as regards all the rest, the palace, this is an error even as regards the comparatively small portion of it which formed the ducal palace in Cosimo's time, and which scarcely amounts to 1/6 of the building. For when the Corso Pitti, when selling the property, was unable to supply Cosimo with Brunelleschi's design, this having in the lapse of the years been lost. Nor even had it been forthcoming with a building designed to accommodate an ordinary citizen family in 1440 sufficed 100 years later for the residence of the Duke of Florence and his court. Be this as it may, Cosimo's palace, when completed, consisted only of the comparatively small central portion of the front block of the present palace. When thus finished by him, it was a plain oblong building, 3 stories high, with 7 windows on the front, which faces the Via Romana, and without either the central court or the 2 great wings on either side of the latter, running back at right angles to the facade, which now formed the great central block of the palace. Thus, in Cosimo's and Eleonora's time, the palace had a very different aspect from the immense building to which we are accustomed, including as it did only that portion of the facade which is embraced by the 7 central windows. This is remarkably corroborated by a little-known picture occupying a dark corner in the long corridor between the Pitti and Uffizi galleries. It shows the portrait of a lady in the ducal court, with in the background the picture of the ducal palace, demonstrating very plainly what its dimensions were in the time of Cosimo I. The picture, owing to its background, is labeled "A Lady of the Pitti Family," but the background itself refutes this, for the palace is represented as completed and roofed, which at once proved that the time is subsequent to that at which the building had any connection with the Pitti family. And we are shown here the palace as it was after being completed by Cosimo I. The picture consequently represents not a lady of the Pitti family, but a lady of the ducal court. In the beginning of the year 1553, the work was sufficiently far advanced to allow the next new palace being occupied, and Cosimo and Eleonora with their 7 children moved into it.
The Boboli Gardens. Cosimo, who was extremely fond of elaborately planned gardens, and was the founder of the Botanical Gardens at Pisa and the Giardino Botanico de Semplici at Florence, took the greatest pleasure in laying out, with the help of Tribolo and Buontalenti, the magnificent gardens behind his new palace, extending up the slope of the Boboli Hill and covering an immense area. While to Eleonora and her children, the change must have been great after the confined precincts of the Palazzo Vecchio. And as in these beautiful gardens we traverse the long avenues of cypress, ilex, and stone pine, or follow the shady pathways amidst banks of roses and azaleas, or sit on the seats of the amphitheatre, overlooking the back of the palace, it is impossible not to think of those 8 children of Cosimo and Eleonora, who were the first of many families of children to play here, and of their checkered histories. Maria, whose sad death at 16 cast the first gloom over the family. Francis, unstable and unenergetic, who succeeded his father. Isabella, destined to die a tragic death at the age of 34. Giovanni, whose death at 19 was so severe a blow to his father's hopes. Lucrezia, married at 15 and dying at 17. Grazia, his mother's favourite son, whose death at 16 was immediately followed by hers. Ferdinand, capable and full of energy, who succeeded his brother Francis and carried on the Medici line. And Pietro, 8 years old when his mother died, and either justly or unjustly accused of murdering his young wife when he was only 22. Looking at the palace where they all grew up, one feels that its main interest will always be associated with this first generation of the family who lived here. Fort of San Giorgio. But Cosimo did not only lay out gardens in connection with his new palace. He intended that it should have a fortress in close proximity to it as well. Therefore, on the summit of the Boboli Hill, at the extremity of the gardens, he laid out the lines of the Fort of San Giorgio, also called the Forte di Belvedere. Placed so as to join the line of the city walls, and on a height more immediately overhanging the city than that of San Miniato, it commands the whole of Florence, besides completely defending it on the southern side. And this fort, when completed by his son Ferdinand I, became the stronghold of the Medici family. Art collections. Cosimo, soon after he had, by his marriage with Eleonora di Toledo, become rich enough to undertake such a quest, set about a diligent search for traces of the ancient Etruscans, making extensive excavations at Chiusi, the ancient Clusium, Arezzo, and other places in Etruria, to search for specimens of Etruscan art, while at the same time he purchased all rare Etruscan and Egyptian antiquities which chance threw in his way. These efforts of his had important consequences. For this search for remains of the ancient inhabitants of Tuscany was continued by his descendants, producing an immense collection of most valuable and interesting specimens of the art of the Etruscans, and objects revealing their mode of life. And these, combined with the Egyptian antiquities also gradually accumulated, resulted in the two collections which now form the Etruscan and Egyptian museums of Florence, the former being considered probably the finest Etruscan museum in the world. Among the numerous interesting remains of Etruscan art which Cosimo obtained from these excavations were the fine statue of Minerva, found near Arezzo in 1541, the celebrated Chimera, found near Arezzo in 1554, and the statue known as the Orator, found near the Trasimene Lake in 1566, all being of bronze. The most valuable of these finds was the statue of the Chimera, or fire-breathing monster, having the body of a lion, a goat's head springing from the back, and for the tail a serpent which is biting the goat's head, a statue contemporaneous with the Wolf of Rome. It was, however, held to be inauspicious to Florence, and so was kept by Cosimo in his private room in the Palazzo Vecchio, and not exhibited to the public. From the time that he moved into his new palace, Cosimo began to turn his attention to the collection, with the assistance of Vasari and Bronzino, of a gallery of pictures, such as that which his ancestors had gathered round them in former days in the palace in the Via Larga. The plunder of the Medici art collections, which had taken place in 1494 and again in 1527, had dissipated the collections made by the elder branch, scattering far and wide most of what had not been destroyed. Valuable pictures which had been the property of the Medici having even found their way to France and Germany. But some portion of these art treasures were still in Florence, dispersed among different families or hidden away elsewhere, and Cosimo had search made for these, and brought back as many of them as he could find for the embellishment of his new palace, including portraits of former members of the family, a few statues and busts, and objects of art such as the vases which had belonged to Lorenzo the Magnificent. At the same time he set Bronzino to work to paint, from such materials as existed in the shape of representations on medallions, frescoes, or otherwise, the portraits of all the Medici, from Giovanni de' Bicci downwards. Bronzino carried out this work with great care and long labour, and the series of portraits that he painted of the older Medici for Cosimo and which are now in the Uffizi gallery, are among his best works. Vasari, who was also at work for Cosimo in other directions, says, "In some small pictures painted on plates of copper, and all of the same size, he, Bronzino, painted all the great men of the house of Medici, beginning with Giovanni de Medici and Cosimo the Elder, down to the Queen of France, Catherine, in that line, and in the other, from Lorenzo, brother of Cosimo the Elder, down to Duke Cosimo and his children, the which portraits are behind the door of the studio made by Vasari in the apartments of the new rooms of the ducal palace. The two fine portraits of Cosimo I and Eleonora di Toledo gave Bronzino the reputation of the best Florentine portrait painter of his time. The years 1551 to 1553 were a troubled time for Charles V, who was harassed with defensive and unsuccessful war against the Turks in Hungary, against France in both Savoy and Lorraine, and against the rising in Germany headed by Maurice of Savoy. And that these troubles were not increased by the war spreading also to Italy was due entirely to the strong position to which Cosimo had by this time brought Tuscany, and to his steady adherence to the cause of the emperor. Nevertheless, in 1552, the peace of Italy was severely endangered by the action of the Republic of Siena, which again rose in revolt against Charles V, drove out the Spanish garrison, and accepted a French garrison in its place. Cosimo was, however, able to prevent the revolt from spreading to other states, and in January 1553 a force was dispatched from Naples to subdue Siena, but owing to the death of the Viceroy of Naples, Don Pedro di Toledo, Eleonora's father, this force failed to effect anything. For his efforts in the emperor's cause, the latter conferred upon Cosimo the coveted honour of the Order of the Golden Fleece. The attempt from Naples having failed, Cosimo now proceeded to undertake the conquest of Siena himself, nominally, of course, on behalf of the emperor, Siena being an imperial fief. He had by this time a large and well-equipped army, partly composed of German, Swiss, and other non-Italian troops, and partly of the Tuscan militia, inaugurated many years before by Machiavelli, which Cosimo had revived and largely increased, while the numerous fortresses of Tuscany were well armed, strongly garrisoned, and commanded by reliable leaders not belonging to Tuscany. The army which he sent against Siena was commanded by Giacomo Medicino, Marquis of Marignano, while that of Siena, consisting chiefly of French troops, was commanded by the skilful soldier Piero Strozzi, Filippo Strozzi's gallant son, who in his unceasing endeavours to avenge his father's death was always to be found opposing Cosimo wherever any fighting was taking place. The war was a long one, Siena making a splendid fight in defence of her ancient republic. Piero Strozzi added greatly to his laurels by his conduct of the campaign. It was carried on throughout the Sienese territory, the whole country between Siena and Florence becoming a frequently fought-over battlefield. Cosimo introduced great barbarity into the conflict by his cruel treatment of the country people of the districts traversed by the war, which increased the determined resistance offered to him. At length, in August 1554, Strozzi's army sustained a severe defeat at Marciano, which was followed by the investment of the city of Siena, which endured a terrible siege for many months. Everything that a brave people could do in such a case was done, even the ladies of Siena taking an active part in the defence. When, after untold horrors had been suffered, the end drew near, it was decided that Piero Strozzi, with a portion of the troops, should depart to hold Montalcino, one of Siena's subject cities which was yet unconquered, and the command of the defence then devolved on Blaise de Montluc, Marshal of France, who covered himself with no less glory than Strozzi had done. At length, when out of 40,000 inhabitants, only 6,000 remained alive, and when everything edible had been consumed, Siena surrendered, April 1555. The concluding scene is thus described by Trollope. Quote, "The miserable remnant of the brave garrison marched out with the honours of war, accompanied by 600 families who would not stay to see their beloved city under a tyrant's rule. They marched out into a desolate country. For 2 years no spade had touched the soil. From Montalcino to Siena, from Siena to Florence, no living thing moved upon the face of the land. Many died that day, though Montluc killed his horse to give them food. At Buon Convento, Strozzi met them. At length they reached Montalcino, and there the remnants of Sienese liberty found a haven. The shadow of an ancient republic rested for a while on its old grey walls as faintly as their hopes, but it soon passed over the mouldering dial and disappeared for ever." Thus ended the last of the great Italian republics of the Middle Ages. It had long been in the power either of France or Spain. Cosimo, when once he had conquered Siena, did not treat it badly. He retained almost intact its ancient constitution and preserved the local customs and traditions of its government, so that there was less change than had been the case even in Florence itself. And to this conduct on his part is due the strong local colour which Siena has ever since retained. On that state coming under his rule, Cosimo appointed as Siena's first governor his own personal friend, Niccolini, and built on the spur called the Lizza the strong fort of Santa Barbara, which is still in use. As soon as the war was over, Cosimo paid a long visit to Siena and arranged all these matters himself, and so much to the satisfaction of the Sienese were the various details settled, that Siena never afterwards revolted from the Medici, and became the most loyal portion of their dominions, while in after years that city came to consider it as a right that one member of the Medici family should always be its governor. And out of Cosimo's army of 30,000 men, 7,000 of his best troops were recruited from Siena. In October 1555, the Emperor Charles V, who had been the most prominent figure in European history for 40 years, abdicated at an impressive ceremony held at Brussels, resigning Spain, Naples, the Netherlands, and his other hereditary dominions to his son Philip II, and the imperial dignity to his brother Ferdinand, King of Hungary and Bohemia. He retired to the monastery of Yuste in Spain, and died there in 1558 at the age of 58. In the same year that Charles V abdicated, Pope Julius III died, and was succeeded first by Marcellus II, and after a month by Paul IV. While Cosimo I, by his conquest of Siena and the other acquisitions of territory which he had gradually gained, as well as by the efficient administration of his military affairs, had doubled the territory of Tuscany, and more than doubled her offensive and defensive power, the improvements he wrought in her civil administration were still more important. Cosimo ruled by fear. His government was a tyrannical one, and none dared disobey or evade his commands. But he ruled well. In every department of the state, order and the strictest discipline took the place of disorder and corruption. The administration of justice was entirely remodelled. A proper criminal code was drawn up and rigidly adhered to. Magistrates were well paid and forbidden to receive any sort of bribe, and terrible retribution fell upon any who transgressed. The police had to submit daily to Cosimo a list of all crimes committed during the previous 24 hours, and they had reason to rue it if any attempt to shoot or stab was not promptly followed by the arrest of the criminal. Cosimo's secret prisons, more dreaded than even those of Venice, were kept for those who failed to obey these orders. For the rest, justice had never been so evenly administered. Never in the days of freedom had justice been obtainable as it now was under the rule of a tyrant. Heavy taxes had to be imposed, especially after the great expense of the Sienese War, but Cosimo, by his care over the commerce of the country, enabled the people to bear them. He revived the decaying silk and woolen trades by disobeying Charles V's order to the Italian cities to eschew the fairs of Lyons. Cosimo drew trade away from Genoa and Lucca, while he also captured the lucrative trade in brocades with Sicily and Spain. He set an example in scientific farming and fruit growing. He took a lively interest in the silver mines of Pietrasanta, the marble quarries near Carrara, and the anthracite discoveries on the upper Arno. Concessions were obtained for working the alum of Piombino and the iron of Elba.
Roads, drainage works, harbors, markets, all the appliances of a modern state grew up in all directions under Cosimo's hand. Pisa, then a depopulated desert, was revived again into a flourishing city. Its sanitation was improved by the draining of the surrounding marshes, and its prosperity increased by the introduction of new manufactures. The harbour was reopened by the construction of new docks, the university was re-established, and Tuscans forbidden to take degrees elsewhere. The Pisa School of Botany was founded, and became afterwards very celebrated. While by frequently residing at Pisa with his family, Cosimo made it a fashionable resort. Leghorn was raised from a neglected fishing village of 700 inhabitants to a busy port, and plans were laid for its development, which afterwards bore much fruit under Cosimo's son Ferdinand. Siena had its social and commercial conditions in every way improved, while the Sienese Maremma was drained and agricultural colonies from Lombardy established there. By these and similar methods carried out all over Tuscany, Cosimo advanced the material prosperity of the country no less than he did its political power. Naval and military affairs showed the same energetic rule. Portoferrajo was made a strong naval station, and in addition to his extensive works on its harbour, Cosimo introduced a seafaring population from Sicily and Greece, while he also began the creation of a fleet of galleys, which, under his son Ferdinand, did good service against the Turks and the pirates of the Mediterranean. His army, 30,000 strong, was well equipped. While of his militia, Cosimo was specially proud, and declared that he could mobilize them in 5 days. He studded Tuscany with fortresses which, constructed with the assistance of his celebrated architect and engineer Ammanati, were monuments of defensive strength. As an example of one of these we have the remarkable fortress of San Martino, on the hill above San Piero a Sieve, laid out under Cosimo's orders in order to defend Florence on the north, which, when its garrison and armament were withdrawn 2 centuries later by the Austrian Grand Duke Pietro Leopoldo, 1765 to 1790, was ordered by him not to be destroyed, but to be kept, quote, as a monument of the military architecture of the 16th century, end quote. This fort is a mile in circumference, and the strength of its construction extraordinary. It stands on the spur of a hill, at the foot of which on 3 sides flow the waters of the Sieve, and its lofty keep dominates the whole plain of the Mugello. In the centre of the fort is a capacious reservoir for storing water for the garrison, while, should this be exhausted, a deep staircase in the heart of the mountain enabled the troops to lead their horses without being seen by the enemy down to the Sieve for water. In the depths of the mountain are vast subterranean halls, where were magazines, armories, foundries for making every kind of military equipment, and storerooms for food, so that the fortress was considered able to defy the most formidable enemy. The bastions and walls are of extraordinary thickness and solidity, and they, with the battlements and casemated gateways, are studded everywhere with the Medici arms. Within the walls there is much open space for the movements of troops, which is now cultivated. This fortress was begun by Cosimo I and completed by his son Ferdinand I, with the assistance of the architect Buontalenti. Nor did fleets, troops, and fortresses, the development of trade, and the improvement of civil administration absorb all Cosimo's energies. The Medici have written their sign manual even upon the landscape of Tuscany. Few among the many who look with pleasure on the gentle slopes of the Tuscan hills, covered far and wide with those olive plantations whose soft bluish-green tints add so much to the special beauty of the landscape in Tuscany, realize that this great industry which now forms so large a part of that country's agricultural life is due to Cosimo I, who introduced it as a portion of his measures for improving the agricultural prosperity of the country. Such things last when crowns, castles, and orders of the Golden Fleece have long passed away. By these various measures, Cosimo gradually welded Tuscany into a well-administered modern state, and the leading power in Italy, and they would have made his rule entirely admirable, had they not been combined with vindictive conduct towards all who opposed him, and a tyranny which crushed out all independent spirit. It is observable that he was to some extent conscious of his own limitations. Tyrant as he was, he would at times endeavour to adopt outwardly something of the bonhomie and absence of formality which was customary with his great ancestor Lorenzo the Magnificent. But the role was one alien to his character, and let any presume to treat him in return with the freedom with which they would have treated Lorenzo, and they at once found Cosimo lapse into the cold and stiff demeanour natural to one who ruled by fear alone, and had no sympathy with republican ways. Among Cosimo's numerous successful efforts to promote the manufactures of the country, none was more important in its results than his introduction of the tapestry manufacture, arazzo, an industry which had hitherto been confined to Flanders. Being anxious to establish a manufactory for this industry which should surpass all others, he founded the Florentine tapestry manufactory, and by means of an abnormally high salary, induced two Flemings, Nicholas Karcher and Jean van der Roost, to enter his service for the charge of it, giving them an annual salary of 600 gold scudi, free quarters, and permission to undertake private commissions in addition to their work of charge of the factory. In return, they bound themselves to teach the secrets of their art to a fixed number of Florentines, and to keep 24 tapestries always on hand as examples. All work done for the house of Medici was paid for separately. The results of this action surpassed even Cosimo's expectations. The Florentine tapestry manufactory grew in a short time into great repute, its work being considered fully equal to that of Flanders, and even surpassing the latter in variety of design and harmony of colour. This manufactory had a distinguished career for nearly 200 years, but came to an end when the Medici passed away, the manufactory being closed in 1787 on the death of the last Medici Grand Duke. We are told, "it prospered and fell with the house of Medici." Of the tapestries made by this factory, 124 had been purchased by the Medici family, and these formed part of the gift to the nation made by Anna Maria Ludovica. They were at that time scattered among the various palaces and villas of the family, but they are now to be seen collected together, and forming, with specimens of Flemish and Gobelins tapestry, which also belonged to the Medici, the Galleria degli Arazzi. And a comparison between them and the Flemish and Gobelins tapestries is decidedly to the advantage of the Florentine tapestries. They are exceedingly rich, woven in gold and silver thread, intermixed with silk and wool, the borders especially being very artistically designed. Cosimo, for the amusement of the people, introduced chariot races after the pattern of those of ancient Rome. They were held in the Piazza Santa Maria Novella, where the marble goals are still to be seen. These were originally of wood, but Ferdinand I caused them to be constructed of marble, and placed, as now, on bronze tortoises made by Gian da Bologna. In 1557, 4 years after they moved into the new palace, occurred the first death in Cosimo's family, that of his eldest daughter Maria, who died at 16, and whose charming portrait at about the age of 10 by Bronzino in the Uffizi gallery is well known. In the following century it was declared that this death of his eldest daughter was due to slow poison given her by her father, the motive being asserted to be that, having arranged with Pope Paul IV for her marriage to that pope's nephew, Tabriano, Cosimo discovered that she had fallen in love with another youth, a page at her father's court. No historians of the present day give any credit to this story, which made its first appearance more than 50 years after Maria's death. Moreover, the state archives now show that Cosimo, who was at this time strenuously endeavouring to establish close political relations with Ercole II, Duke of Ferrara, had arranged for Maria's marriage, not, as the story relates, to the Pope's nephew, but to Duke Ercole's eldest son, Alfonso d'Este. So that Cosimo would, by the crime alleged, have destroyed an alliance he was labouring in every way to cement, and have made an enemy of the Duke of Ferrara, whom he was particularly anxious to unite to himself as closely as possible. In 1558, great destruction was caused in Florence by an unusually heavy flood in the Arno, which swept away the Ponte Santa Trinita, the Ponte alla Caraja, and all the houses which were on the Ponte a Rubiconte, the Ponte Vecchio, built by Taddeo Gaddi in 1334 alone of all the bridges, remaining uninjured. Florence became in a few hours a sea of mud and ruin, some parts of the city being submerged to a depth of 22 feet. It was after this flood that Cosimo built his 2 fine bridges to replace the 2 which had been destroyed, the new Ponte Santa Trinita being especially notable. This beautiful bridge, in its proportions, excellence of construction, and the symmetry of its lines, exemplifies the perfection in such architecture then attained in Tuscany, though now unattainable anywhere. Part of the reason why it pleases the eye so much is that its curve is that technically known as a catenary, being that taken by a chain suspended from supports at both ends, a curve which is neither that of an ellipse or of any other geometrical figure, but special to that particular case. In June 1558, Piero Strozzi, the eldest of Filippo Strozzi's 3 sons, was killed at the taking of Thionville. He had spent a large part of his life in warring against Cosimo, and endeavouring to exact vengeance for his father's death, and had become one of the most experienced generals of the time. He had spent many years in France, where he was highly thought of by Catherine de Medici, and was protected by her against the attempts which Cosimo made on his life. Cosimo constantly tried to have him assassinated, but Strozzi never retaliated in the same way, and at his death Cosimo spoke of him with honour, affirming that Strozzi had ever acted against him con la visiera aperta, and that Italy had lost in him one of her principal gentlemen, no small tribute from so vindictive an enemy as Cosimo. In the same year, the latter gave his daughter Isabella, then 16, in marriage to Paolo Giordano Orsini, Prince of Bracciano, and his daughter Lucrezia, then 15, to Alfonso, the eldest son of Ercole II, Duke of Ferrara, instead of her sister Maria, whose untimely death had prevented a similar alliance. In November of this year, Mary Tudor died, and her sister Elizabeth succeeded her as Queen of England. The year 1559 was an important one for Europe. In February, 4 months before Henry II's sudden death at the tournament in Paris, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis between Henry II, Philip II, and Queen Elizabeth put an end to the war in which France, Spain, and England had been engaged, and closed the long struggle between the two former for supremacy in Italy, which, begun by the invasion of Charles VIII, had lasted for over 60 years. That struggle ended in a complete victory for Spain, and the final result was mainly, if not entirely, due to the fact that Tuscany, the most powerful state in Italy, had sided against France and with Spain. By the above treaty, France formally withdrew from Italy, surrendering all her claims in that country. Siena, together with Montalcino, was assured to Cosimo. The Duchy of Savoy, conquered by France 23 years before, was restored to its rightful duke, Emmanuel Philibert, and erected into an independent buffer state between Italy and France. Spain remained in possession of both North and South Italy, while Cosimo held the centre, and the peace thus created in Italy lasted for over half a century. In June, Philip II married Elizabeth of France, daughter of Henry II, who, being killed a few days later, was succeeded by his son Francis II. In July, Philip II quitted the Netherlands, which country, during the remaining 39 years of his life, he never again visited. Before leaving, he appointed as governor of the Netherlands his half-sister, Margaret of Parma, and held at Ghent the last chapter of the Order of the Golden Fleece that was ever assembled. In August, Pope Paul IV, who, during his 4 years' pontificate, had been a constant cause of war in Italy, died, and was succeeded by Pius IV. The new pope was of humble origin, and though named Giovanni Angelo Medici, or Medicino, was no connection of the Medici of Florence. Nevertheless, on becoming pope, he assumed the arms of the latter, and Cosimo made no objection, hoping to obtain solid advantages through this pope's friendship. For Cosimo was now silently at work upon a project which he had for some time been secretly nourishing. We are told that the leading marks of Cosimo's character were, quote, "profound sagacity, deep dissimulation, impenetrable darkness, extreme caution, patience, resolution, and indomitable perseverance," end quote. And the project for which Cosimo was now, in accordance with these characteristics, secretly working, was nothing less than the realization of that which had been the culminating point of the dream of Clement VII. As a duke, he was theoretically merely the emperor's lieutenant. As a grand duke, he would be a reigning monarch. Cosimo could not hope to obtain that crown upon which his aim was set through the regular channel, the emperor. Ferdinand I, like his dead brother Charles V, would not be likely to entertain for a moment a proposal to place a crown on the head of one who, only a few years ago, had been an unknown youth, to whom it had been a great favour to allow him to become ruler of Florence and the emperor's vassal. But future emperors, further removed from the days of 1537, might not be so opposed, and in the meantime it might be possible to obtain the coveted dignity through another channel, that of the Pope. For this object paramount influence at Rome was all important, and to attain this Cosimo was steadily employing every means at his disposal, though allowing none to know what was his ultimate aim in doing so. Pius IV was soon entirely under his domination, and when in 1560 Cosimo paid a visit to Rome and was entertained by this pope, his influence was so powerful that the pope, sensible that Cosimo was now by far the most important ruler in Italy, wished, we are told, to make him a king, or what was practically the same thing, a reigning Grand Duke. But Cosimo put the suggestion aside as a mere polite piece of flattery outside practical politics. It was what he was quietly working for, but his excessive caution made him feel that the time for such a step was not now, when the nations of Europe had just made peace together, or while Ferdinand I was emperor. When France and Spain should be again at enmity, when England should be involved in war with one or other of them, and when a weaker emperor should have succeeded Ferdinand I, and one perhaps allied to his family in marriage, then such a step might be hazarded without danger of provoking opposition other than that of mere verbal protests. Moreover, his relative Catherine, who hated Cosimo and thwarted him on many occasions, began in this year 1560 her long career of power in France, and Cosimo, foreseeing that she would soon be involved in difficulties with both Spain and England, if not also with Germany, when she would be unable to offer any active opposition to his design, preferred to wait until this should be the case. In the meantime, he succeeded so well in the preliminary step of establishing a paramount influence at Rome that 3 successive popes were practically governed by him. Meanwhile, Cosimo adopted measures to establish still more firmly the position of his family, already much strengthened by the marriages of his daughters, one of whom was now Duchess of Ferrara, and the other Princess of Bracciano, the wife of the most powerful prince in Rome. In 1560, through his influence with Pius IV, Cosimo succeeded in getting his second son Giovanni, now 17, made a cardinal, thus imitating the course which Lorenzo the Magnificent had so successfully taken with that other Giovanni who had become Pope Leo X. Cosimo hoped that Giovanni, who was his favorite son, would achieve similar success, while his joining the ranks of the cardinals would help to strengthen that influence at Rome which Cosimo had special reasons for desiring. He also, in 1561, instituted the Tuscan order of knighthood, the order of Santo Stefano, which afterwards became very famous in Tuscany and highly sought after. It was a naval order, and its primary objects were laid down as being 1. To rid the Mediterranean of pirates, 2. To liberate the Christians held captive by the pirates and the Turks, and 3. To propagate the Christian faith. The Duke himself was the Grand Master, and by the order being confined to the nobility and made the chief order of Tuscany, the knights became a sort of permanent bodyguard for the protection of the Duke and his dynasty. Being a naval order, the Knights of Santo Stefano had their conventual palace and church at Pisa, and the church is hung with Moorish banners taken by them from the Turks and the Barbary pirates, and with the figureheads of Turkish galleys captured in war. The knights won special honor at the Battle of Lepanto, 1571. The cross of the order was similar in shape to that of the Knights of Malta, but in color red instead of white. In this same year, 1561, Cosimo and Eleonora, who had already lost one of their 3 daughters, heard of the death at Ferrara of their daughter Lucrezia, Duchess of Ferrara, at the age of 17. It was in after years declared that she was poisoned by her husband on the ground of infidelity, but this statement is considered by the highest authority to be quite untrue, and to have been entirely fabricated by the Florentine fuoriusciti.
And now there fell upon Cosimo a terrible domestic disaster. Death of Giovanni, Garda, and Eleonora di Toledo. In October 1562, he started on a tour through Grosseto, the Maremma, and Leghorn to Pisa, to see in person various military and engineering works which he had inaugurated at those places. He took with him his wife Eleonora, who had been suffering from hemorrhage of the lungs for more than a year, and was recommended by the doctors to go for the winter to the milder climate near the sea-coast, and his 3 sons, Giovanni, Garzia, and Ferdinand. A bad epidemic of malarial fever was in that year devastating a large part of Tuscany, and especially the Maremma, and the doctors urged Cosimo not to take with him his young sons. But the latter were eager for the chances of sport on such a trip, and persuaded their father to disregard the advice. The expedition had a sad ending, for within a single month Eleonora, Giovanni, and Garzia all died from malarial fever. Giovanni on their reaching Leghorn, and Garzia and his mother 3 weeks later at Pisa. Such an event could not, in Cosimo's case, fail to form a foundation for a tragic tale of murder, and accordingly we find put forward a highly dramatic one, purporting to convey the true story of those 3 deaths, and stating that in a quarrel, while the 2 brothers were out shooting near Leghorn, Garzia had stabbed his brother Giovanni, who died 3 days later in consequence. That Cosimo was so enraged at this death of his favourite son that he drew his sword and killed Garzia with his own hands, and that Eleonora died of grief and horror at the double crime. This account, which has continued to the present day, was that related by the various historians of that age. The latter, unable to obtain access to the private documents of the Medici family, were forced to rely on information often felt by them to be dubious, and several of them, though giving this account, throw doubts upon its truth. The chief cause of their uncertainty was that however deeply the subject was probed, in no case could it be discovered with whom the report originated. Added to which, every investigation showed that it had no origin in Tuscany, but that all the different versions of the story had this in common, that they all emanated from Rome, the principal abode of the Florentine exiles. From thence, spread by letters and newsagents to Venice, to France, and above all to the large body of ecclesiastics assembled at the Council of Trent, the story soon became the common opinion outside Tuscany, and was eagerly taken up by every foreign enemy of Cosimo throughout Europe. But this account of these deaths did not all appear at the same time. Its Roman authors, whoever they were, brought it out piecemeal. When on the 20th of November Giovanni died, it was stated that he had been killed by his brother Garzia. When 3 weeks later Garzia died, an addition was made to the effect that Giovanni, when wounded, had in retaliation also wounded Garzia, and that this was the cause of the latter's death. At this point the story remained for some 50 years. To this first portion of the story there was, however, added more than 50 years later a further embellishment of it, to the effect that Garzia's death had not been caused as previously stated, but that Cosimo, enraged at Giovanni's death, had killed his younger son with his own hands, and that Eleonora's death had been caused by horror thereat. During the intervening 50 years, no single letter, document, or historical writing throughout Italy had ever conveyed even a hint of this deed. This addition, by making the story so dramatic, increased its chance of spreading. while since it was produced long after Cosimo was dead, it was evidently aimed not so much at himself as at his family. It rapidly spread and soon became the common belief. The state archives in these days supply the information which the historians of a former day lacked, and recent research therein has furnished a mass of evidence which conclusively disposes of both portions of the story, and shows that the historians who doubted its truth were right. This evidence includes 2 letters from Cosimo to his eldest son Francis, then in Spain, relating the events which had occurred to the family during the latter part of this untoward trip. In the first of these, dated 20th of November, 1562, he tells his son that on the 15th, Giovanni had been attacked by malignant fever at Rossignano, that they had promptly moved from thence to Leghorn, but that he became worse and had died there on the date of the letter, that Garcia and Ferdinand also had fever, but less severely, and that he was going to take them next day to Pisa, where it was hoped they would recover, and that this exceptionally malignant type of fever was very bad all over the part of the country that they had been traversing. This is followed by a second letter from Cosimo to his eldest son, dated 18th of December, written amidst all the grief at the death that day of his wife Eleonora, in which he tells Francis that Garcia's fever had increased after their arrival at Pisa, that after a severe illness of 21 days he had died on the 12th of December, and that his mother, worn out by her exertions in nursing him, while she was herself also ill, had succumbed 6 days later, and giving full details of their last hours. These letters, together with the other documents in the state archives already referred to, prove with great completeness that the story which so long obtained credence as the history of this episode is a complete fable, one perhaps scarcely expected to be taken seriously, even by its unknown authors. It was, in fact, one of a series which had their origin in the manner by which Cosimo gained his throne. From the day of Monte Merlo, a ceaseless war was waged between Cosimo and that large number of Florentine families who had lost near relatives in his ruthless executions after that battle and lived in exile, a war in which Cosimo, cruel and vindictive, slew his enemies with the sword whenever his arm could reach them, and in which the exiles, no less vindictive, but poverty-stricken and without the resources he possessed, responded by attempts to murder him, and by a constant stream of stories of this nature poured forth unremittingly, on the principle that if enough mud is thrown, some must stick. The Cambridge Modern History, than which there is no higher authority, dismisses the entire story in contempt with the following remark. Quote, "In the autumn of 1562, he, Cosimo, had lost within a few days from Maremma fevers his wife and his 2 sons, Garcia and Giovanni. A year earlier his well-loved daughter Lucrezia died shortly after her marriage to Alfonso II of Ferrara. These natural misfortunes were in the following century caught up by scandalmongers and Florentine exiles, and distorted into dramatic tragedies of adultery and poison, fratricide and parricide, which have passed muster as the inner history of the reign." Unquote. But even without any such terrible additions to its natural features, this episode was sufficiently tragic. Of the family party of 5, who had started for a pleasant trip together, only 2, Cosimo and his young son Ferdinand, returned. Cosimo had lost within a month the devoted wife who had been his constant companion and adviser for 23 years, and 2 sons, on one of whom, through his recent creation as a cardinal, he had built many hopes, while both of them possessed many attractive qualities. All the 3 bodies were brought back to Florence and buried in San Lorenzo. the funeral of Giovanni being scarcely over before the grave was again opened to receive the bodies of his mother and brother. And in one corner of the crypt of the family mausoleum, these four lie buried together: Cosimo, Eleonora, Giovanni, and Garzia, the last three with the following dates of death upon their tombstones: Giovanni, 20th of November, 1562, Garzia, 12th of December, 1562, and Eleonora, 18th December, 1562. Bronzino's fine portrait of poor Garzia, who is given a charming character by those who knew him, and who, dying at 16, has had his name thus defamed for centuries to gratify political animosity against his father, must have been painted only a few months before the family left Florence, on the tour which was to end so disastrously. Of her 5 sons, he was his mother's favourite son. She loved him as her own eyes, says an old chronicler. This loss was a severe blow to Cosimo, and under it he became more than ever dark, sullen, and impenetrable. It left him with only 4 children: Francis, now 22, Isabella, 21, Ferdinand, 14, and Pietro, a child of 8. Isabella, returning soon afterwards from Rome, took charge of her father's household, her husband Orsini being content that she should live in Florence while he remained at Rome. Eleonora di Toledo. Eleonora di Toledo, the only Spanish wife whom the Medici ever took, their other matrimonial alliances being all with France or Austria, deserves a much more prominent place in the history of that family than she has received. The very large part which she had in the establishment of Cosimo's power in the years 1539 to 1549 has failed altogether to be recognised. Yet Eleonora di Toledo might almost be looked upon as a second founder of the family, so great was the assistance which she brought to Cosimo when, as a youth of 20, he was destitute of wealth, family, friends, or influence to support the tottering throne which he had seized, but which without her he would probably in a very short time have lost, together with his own life. Many have wondered how it was that at the beginning of his career, Cosimo, so signally without the means to effect such a result, should have been able so quickly and firmly to establish his power. The secret lies in Eleonora di Toledo. Cosimo in time himself became rich by a sound fiscal policy and by the private trading which he throughout his life carried on. But these sources of income took time to develop, and his urgent want at the commencement was money with which to start such operations and to maintain a military force for his own protection. Eleonora brought him the immediately available wealth of which he stood so much in need. Cosimo was also without friends or influence to back him. Eleonora brought him the powerful support of her father, whose only child she was, and who as ruler over the whole of southern Italy was always able to put pressure upon the Pope to prevent the latter from molesting Cosimo, as he was very desirous of doing. Above all, Eleonora had exactly the kind of character which made her an admirable wife to a man of Cosimo's peculiar disposition. She understood how to treat his dark and gloomy moods and to soothe his fierce rage. She was strongly devoted to him, and never lost her great influence with him during all the 23 years of their married life. She was the only channel to his favour, and she was throughout her life a most sensible adviser to him. Though accustomed until she arrived in Florence to the far greater grandeur of her father's vice-regal palace at Naples, she never complained of being given as a residence the gloomy Palazzo Vecchio, until after 10 years Cosimo's circumstances enabled him to provide her with a more suitable abode. Lastly, the extent and beneficial nature of her influence is amply demonstrated by the marked deterioration to be observed in Cosimo's character from the time that death deprived him of her, when she was 40 years of age. Eleonora's splendid portrait by Bronzino in the Uffizi gallery, with her little son Ferdinand by her side, is the finest of all Bronzino's many portraits. Whatever may be the reason, her face has an expression of sadness, and the picture has for its background the night scene of a dreary marshy landscape with dark desolate hills in the distance, which accords with this expression. The picture was evidently painted sometime in the year 1558, when she was 31, and Ferdinand, then her youngest born, was 4 years old. She wears a magnificent dress of white satin, heavily embroidered all over with rich black galloon trimming of a very marked pattern, on her head a net of gold cord set with pearls, round her neck a string of large pearls, and round her waist a girdle having a large tassel of pearls. This dress had an important subsequent history. Eleonora was the first who was buried in the manner ever afterwards customary in this family, all the members of which from this time onwards were buried dressed in their most splendid costumes and wearing numerous jewels. And Eleonora was buried dressed as she appears in this portrait. In 1857, a commission was appointed by the state to open and examine all the Medici coffins, which, owing to their having been kept without due security after the Medici passed away, had, in the early part of the 19th century, been broken into by thieves for the sake of the jewels they contained, and were in considerable disorder. When this examination took place, Eleonora's coffin was one of the few found without any name or inscription, either outside or inside, but her remains were at once recognised by this dress, which was familiar to all through Bronzino's well-known portrait. The official report on the examination of the coffins states in regard to hers, quote, "The body was recognised with certainty by the rich dress of white satin, richly embroidered with galloon trimming all over both the bodice and the skirt, exactly as she is depicted in the portrait painted by Bronzino, which is in the gallery of the statues, together with the same net of gold cord worn on the hair. Beneath this dress was an undergown of crimson velvet, and on the feet shoes similarly of crimson velvet." Unquote. The string of pearls round her neck and the girdle with the tassel of pearls had, however, been stolen. Cosimo, notwithstanding the heavy domestic blow which he had suffered, did not relax his pursuit of the aim on which his mind was set. To this end it was highly important to have one son a cardinal, who would maintain a constant watch over Cosimo's interests at Rome, and within a month of the funeral of his wife and sons, he obtained from Pius IV the creation as cardinal of his fourth son Ferdinand to take the place of the dead Giovanni, though Ferdinand was only in his 14th year. In December 1568, the Council of Trent, which had sat for 18 years, finished its labours and was dissolved. Pope Pius IV, the pope who made himself a member of the Medici family, has obtained a lasting memorial in the work of this council from the fact that it drew up a new creed, called by his name, which has ever since had to be accepted, in addition to the 3 creeds of antiquity, by all belonging to the Church of Rome. As regards the primary object for which it was convened, the Council of Trent achieved nothing. Abandoning the endeavour to reunite Christendom, to attain which object the convocation of this council had been so anxiously striven after for so many years before it was assembled, It made no attempt to deal with the evil which Pope Adrian VI had so ably diagnosed as the cause of the disease, or to apply that remedy which he had pointed out as the only one, a limitation of the absolutism of the head of the Church, an attempt which even the councils of Pisa, Constance, and Bâle had made. On the contrary, this council turned its whole attention to re-establishing the papacy on the footing on which it had stood in the 13th century, so that instead of uniting, it accentuated the differences between the two parties more than ever. Nevertheless, the Emperor Ferdinand I did not even yet give up the hope of effecting a reconciliation. As soon as the council had dispersed after this abortive conclusion, the Emperor, following to some extent the example which Catherine de Medici had set 2 years before in France, caused George Cassander, a highly learned Belgian theologian, to draw up a statement of the points of controversy between the two parties, to serve as a basis for a fresh conference on the subject. This Cassander did in a very able and broad-minded treatise entitled A Consideration of the Articles of Religion under Dispute between Catholics and Protestants, which was duly published. But owing to the Emperor's death, no further result ensued. In 1564 the Emperor Ferdinand I died, and was succeeded by his son, Maximilian II, with whom Cosimo hoped to be able to establish closer relations. In this he was successful, and in January 1565 Cosimo's eldest son Francis was married to the Emperor Maximilian's sister, the Archduchess Joanna of Austria, daughter of the Emperor Ferdinand I and niece of the Emperor Charles V. It was another step upwards on the ladder which the Medici had for so many generations been climbing, being the most exalted marriage they had ever yet made, and Cosimo had good reason to hope that it would materially assist him when the time should come for him to put forward a claim to be no longer merely Duke of Florence, but a crowned head. It did not, however, augur well for the chances of happiness of Francis and Joanna that the former had been for more than a year passionately attached to the beautiful Venetian Bianca Capello, while the Archduchess was not only plain in appearance and unattractive in manner, but also made no secret that she considered the marriage one altogether derogatory to her dignity. As Cosimo was anxious to do honour in every way to his son's bride, nothing was omitted which could add splendour to the occasion. It was settled that the Palazzo Vecchio should be made over to Francis and Joanna as their residence, and the old castle of the Signoria of Florence was, under Cosimo's orders, beautified in every way by Vasari to fit it for the abode of an archduchess. The suite of apartments which had been occupied by Cosimo and Eleonora was entirely redecorated. Round the vestibule of the cortile were painted fresco pictures of Austrian towns, so that Joanna should have familiar scenes to look at. The massive pillars of the cortile were adorned with stucco ornaments on a gold ground, which still remain, though the gold has disappeared. And in the centre of the court, Cosimo placed Verrocchio's beautiful fountain of the Boy with the Dolphin, which had been made for Lorenzo the Magnificent's villa of Careggi, while a pipe conducting specially pure water from the Boboli Hill was brought over the Ponte Vecchio to supply the water which flows from this fountain. The Archduchess arrived in Florence in January 1565, and the marriage, which took place in San Lorenzo, was a very magnificent ceremony, and was followed by a week of public festivities of the most lavish description. The Passaggio. In addition to these arrangements, Cosimo, in connection with this marriage of his son with the Emperor's sister, constructed another work which still remains one of the notable sights of Florence. In imitation of the passage which Homer describes as uniting the palace of Hector with that of Priam, as well as to provide a means of escape for his family in time of disturbance, Cosimo arranged to connect by a long covered gallery his own palace with the Palazzo Vecchio, now to be occupied by his son. He therefore ordered Vasari to construct the celebrated Passaggio, a corridor of nearly half a mile long through a crowded part of the city, starting from the Palazzo Vecchio, passing over the building known as the Uffizi, or public offices, which Cosimo had built in 1561, over the top of the shops on the Ponte Vecchio, through houses and over streets, until it reached the ducal palace. The work must have been executed with great rapidity, for the contract was only signed on the 12th March 1565, and Lapini tells us that the corridor was finished by November. The contract for this work gives some details interesting to those who know Florence in these days. It lays down that, quote, "there shall be an arch above the street, where is the dogana to the wall of the church of San Piero Scheraggio, and another arch at the house of Signor Trajano Boba, and along the Lungano a corridor with arches and pilasters, as far as the Ponte Vecchio. Thence, proceeding onwards above the shops and houses of the said bridge, on the side towards the Ponte a Rubaconte, and round the tower of the house of Matteo Manelli by means of stone brackets. From this tower, another arch spanning the Via de' Bardi shall rest upon the tower of the Parte Guelfa, opposite the house of the Manelli. The corridor is then to follow the small alley behind the houses, facing the principal street, and pass above the portico of the church of Santa Felicita, where is to be made a loggia. Thence the corridor, supported on pilasters along the whole length of the cloisters of the clergy of Santa Felicita, shall gradually descend to the level of the garden of the Pitti. The said corridor and its adjuncts are to be roofed in, the ceilings plastered, whitewashed, and finished according to the orders, designs, and models given from time to time by the magnificent and excellent master Giorgio Vasari." End quote. The sentence in this contract, ordering the corridor to be carried round the outside of the Palazzo Manelli on brackets, is interesting. That palace occupies the end of the bridge, and had belonged to the Manelli family for many generations. Its position appeared to make it unavoidable that Cosimo's new corridor should pass through it. Accordingly, Mellini says, Cosimo sent for the owners of the said palace and asked if they were willing, courteously, to permit him to make the passage through it. But they strongly objected, pointing out that it would spoil their house. Whereupon he, Cosimo, placed it as we now see it on stone brackets, passing by a sharp turn round the outside of the house. Nor did he bear them ill will, saying that every one was master of his own house. Hitherto, the shops on the Ponte Vecchio had been occupied by butchers. On making the Passaggio, Cosimo ordered them to vacate, and directed all the jewellers in Florence to inhabit these shops, and this has ever since been the jewellers' quarter. From the time of his eldest son's marriage, Cosimo made over to him the entire control of home affairs, though still retaining in his own hands foreign affairs. In the same year, 1565, Pope Pius IV died and was succeeded by Pius V, Michele Ghislieri, the stern old inquisitor and a pitiless persecutor of the new religion. With such a pope, it was not difficult to see what kind of conduct would be most conducive to the maintenance of that paramount influence at the Vatican which it was Cosimo's earnest desire to retain, and the more so since affairs in France, Spain and Germany showed that the time was approaching when he would be able to take the step for which he had long been preparing. The character of the new pope soon made itself felt throughout Italy, a general stamping out of Protestantism wherever it had taken root began. This placed in danger a man who had long been a firm friend of the Medici family, and who had done good service for Cosimo in particular in various capacities. Carnesecchi was a Florentine of very good family, who had been proto-notary apostolic to Clement VII, and of so much influence with him that it was said he rather than Clement was pope. Some years after Clement's death he came under the influence and teaching of Valdez, became a Protestant, and ere long one of the leading Protestants in Italy. After spending some years in France he returned to Italy, but in 1557 was pronounced by Pope Paul IV a refractory heretic and had to fly for his life. He fled to France to Catherine de Medici, who protected him. On the death of Paul IV, he returned to Florence, where during the pontificate of Pius V he remained unmolested and was one of Cosimo's most trusted friends and advisers. But the election of Pope Pius V placed Carnesecchi at once in danger which was increased by his having recently entreated Cosimo to exert his great influence with the emperor to bring about the assembly of a really ecumenical council in the centre of Germany, and to effect the Pope's personal attendance thereat. Pope Pius V, dreading the effect of Cosimo's influence if exerted in the manner urged by Carnesecchi, earnestly desired to remove this friend and adviser from Cosimo's side, and was eager to get hold of Carnesecchi and hand him over to the Inquisition. Catherine de Medici, on the other hand, had written to Cosimo urging him to protect Carnesecchi in the same way as she had done, and to refuse the Pope's demand for his surrender. But Cosimo, throughout life, ruthlessly sacrificed all who came in the way of his plans. He was bent upon an object which only the Pope's favour could obtain for him, and he knew well that Carnesecchi's life would be the price. Therefore, to his lasting shame, he in July 1566 surrendered this faithful adherent of himself and his family to the Pope, and in October 1567 Carnesecchi was burnt in Rome by the Inquisition. 2 years afterwards Cosimo received his reward. Carnesecchi was the last of the chief reformers in Italy, and with his death the reforming spirit in that country, which at one time had been very strong, died out. Grand Duke of Tuscany. In 1569, the year of the battles of Jarnac and Moncontour in France, when Catherine de Medici's troubles were at their height, Cosimo considered the time at last propitious for the step he had long contemplated. France was blazing from end to end with civil war. Spain was occupied with the contest in the Netherlands, and endeavouring also to take part in the conflict in France. England was embroiled with both France and Spain, and in Germany the Emperor Maximilian had his hands full with similar troubles. None were therefore likely to interfere actively against Cosimo's assumption of regal dignity. Accordingly, we are informed that owing to Cosimo's great influence with Pope Pius V and his many good offices to the papal see, that pope now published a bull creating Cosimo I Grand Duke of Tuscany. In doing this, the pope was, of course, assuming the prerogative of the emperor. But Cosimo trusted in time to get the latter to acquiesce in what was a fait accompli. Nor was the Pope's action unjustified from the general point of view. Cosimo had raised Tuscany to such a position of power and importance that her ruler was justly to be considered on a level with other sovereign rulers of states, not in any way in advance of his in these respects. In February 1570, Cosimo was, with much ceremony, crowned in Rome by the Pope. Spain and Germany refused to acknowledge Cosimo's new rank. France and England, however, did so, and within the next few years the other powers of Europe, one by one, concurred. The shape of the new crown was peculiar and was carefully laid down in the Pope's bull. This ordered that the crown of Tuscany was, unlike the French, Spanish, and other crowns, to be radiated, like that of the Eastern kings, alternate with the Florentine lily. It was a royal crown with the points curving outwards, intended to represent the blades of the iris. In the centre of the front was a large red Florentine lily, thus making the crest of Florence's ancient republic the chief jewel of the royal crown. The sceptre was also peculiar. It was ordered to be surmounted by the Medici Palace, and upon this the Florentine lily. The portrait of Cosimo painted to commemorate this occasion shows him wearing his robes as Grand Duke, with on his head the new crown, and in his hand the sceptre. Thus had the Medici reached at length the summit of their career, and a crown was at last placed upon a Medici head. 170 years from the time that Giovanni de Medici, the humble banker of Florence, is first heard of, his descendant, the head of the house, entered the group of European sovereigns. Fate, in irony, had realized the long dream of Clement VII in a manner far different from his intentions, and had placed the crown which he had schemed to gain in the future for his family upon the head not of a scion of the elder branch, but of the son of that Giovanni delle Bande Nere whom he had striven to keep from succeeding to the honours of the Medici, and had thought finally disposed of on the battlefield of Governolo. The remaining 4 years of Cosimo's life were only notable for the general deterioration in his character, which, beginning to set in from the time of Eleonora's death, and increasing year by year, became in these last 4 years strongly pronounced. Leaving the entire government of the country to the inefficient hands of his son Francis, he lived chiefly in retirement at the villa of Castello, with a new wife, not at all in his own rank, named Camilla Martelli, whom he had married about the year 1571, and who was treated as a sort of morganatic wife. This marriage gave the greatest offence to his sons, who refused to recognise Camilla as really their father's wife, while this and undignified disputes in which he was involved with her relations caused Cosimo's latter days to be wanting in either peace or dignity. He died at the villa of Castello on the 21st of April 1574 at the age of 55, after a reign of 37 years. Cosimo, whose tomb bears the inscription Magnus Dux Etruriae Primus, was interred with great pomp in San Lorenzo, clad in his robe as Grand Master of the Order of Santo Stefano, and wearing his jewelled crown and sceptre and his Order of the Golden Fleece. The Medici were regardless of expense in the matter of crowns. They objected to wear crowns of which even the jewels ornamenting them had been worn by their predecessors, and each Medici Grand Duke was buried wearing his actual crown, not an imitation of it, and with his jewelled sceptre by his side, an entirely fresh crown and sceptre being made for his successor. As a consequence, when in the early part of the 19th century the Medici coffins were plundered by thieves, the latter sought chiefly for those of the Grand Dukes. Owing, however, to the darkness of the lower crypt and the manner in which the coffins on removal thither had been piled together in different parts of it, without any system, the thieves were only able to find the coffins of 5 out of the 7 Medici Grand Dukes, those of Cosimo III and Gian Gastone, which had no distinctive marks on the outside, escaping detection. These, however, were the only 2 in which the crown and sceptre were found when the coffins were opened in 1857 by the commission appointed for the purpose, that of Cosimo I being among those found entirely plundered. The body was dressed in the robes of the Order of Santo Stefano, with under these a doublet of red satin and hose of the same colour on the legs. His sword was extraordinarily large, and in the velvet lining of the scabbard, hidden by the gilded hilt, were enclosed a small dagger and a number of small stiletti, with very sharp points, almost as fine as needles, stuck into the lining of the scabbard as into a needle case. The robbed and broken coffin did not contain the golden crown, the sceptre, and other ornaments which should have been found there. In Cosimo I, the prominent characteristic is a pitiless ferocity. No sentiment of generosity, magnanimity, or mercy ever stirred his nature. His enmity worked with as little pity and as little remorse as a machine. Death, prompt and cruel, ensued for all who failed to obey his will or thwarted his purposes. The doors of the Bargello closed behind them, and the scaffold in its courtyard saw their end. Or if they escaped from Florence, then the hired assassin was equally sure. Together with this characteristic there was another, of meanness of character. Among other evidences of this, there was in him, the son of the bravest leader of troops in Italy, that want of personal courage which so frequently accompanies a cruel nature. He never ventured into a battle himself, sending other men to risk their lives for his advantage, and he carefully surrounded himself with a bodyguard, which his cruelties made a very necessary precaution. But the defects of a cruel and ignoble disposition must not be allowed to hide his undoubtedly great work for his country. In thinking of Tuscany, we are too apt to regard it as it had become in the beginning of the 18th century, and so to lose sight of the prosperous kingdom which Cosimo I created in the 16th. It is indeed strange to compare the small, misgoverned, and insignificant state which this son of Giovanni delle Bande Nere and Maria Salviati seized by his bold coup d'etat of 1537. Its capital half ruined by the long siege of 1530, its scanty territory devastated by the war, and its whole condition brought to degradation by Alessandro's 5 years' misrule, with the large and flourishing kingdom which Cosimo, its first Grand Duke, left to his successors. He found Tuscany a small and despised state, dependent on a foreign power, without troops, commerce, agriculture, or resources, with ruined towns, a wasted country, and a poverty-stricken population. He left her a large and independent kingdom with a powerful army, a rising fleet, flourishing manufactures, wide commerce, sound laws, model public works, a well-ordered administration, and a thriving people. He successfully resisted the most powerful pope of his time and governed 3 others in succession. He saved Tuscany from becoming, like Milan, a province of Spain, and he made her the leading state in Italy. There is probably no other example of so small a state advancing within a period of some 30 years to a position of power and importance scarcely inferior to most of the monarchies of the time. It is this comparison between what he found and what he left which gives the true measure of Cosimo I. In ability, he didn't fall far short of those earlier Medici, who had advanced Florence over the heads of all her rivals in their time, and made her the artistic and intellectual capital of Italy. It would have been well had he shown also those other qualities of character which they, in addition to their abilities, had possessed, of a generous and high-minded spirit, readiness to forgive injuries, mercy to enemies, courtesy of demeanour, and sympathy with the people. But these qualities were foreign to his nature, and his rule was that of an iron-handed tyranny. It was Florence's own deliberate action which had brought that tyranny upon her. On Alessandro's death she could, if she would, have reinstated her republic. Completely untrammelled, and under no pressure from any direction, she deliberately, of her own will, subjected herself to the rule of a tyrant. But, tyrant as he was, the effects of his tyranny did not fall upon the mass of the people, and by his even-handed justice, his strong government, capable administration, sound fiscal laws, and advancement of the material prosperity of the country, Cosimo I made the condition of the inhabitants of Tuscany one altogether superior to any which they had ever known before. End of section 28. Read by Jane Bennett.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.